We want to help China, not hurt it. The Chinese economy will be hurt the most. This is China versus the world.
Well, if 5% growth or 5.2% growth is weak, then I'd hate to think how Scott Bessent would describe the American economy at 2%. Scott Bessent has a demonstrated track record over the last 6 months of overreach and hyperbole.
BRICS is made up of 5 seemingly disparate countries: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa.
BRICS is not the only institution that is integral to the unfolding multipolarization of the world. Others include things like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization.
China is prepared to defend world order alongside Russia, talking about creating now what they call the multipolar world order.
The world really becoming multi-nodal. Foundationally to China's economic development was actually educating people. Secondly, invest in people. Make sure people are healthy.
After Russia invaded Ukraine in early 2022, Europe escaped the immediate energy shock better than many expected. While prices did shoot up.
Europe's problem is it has not solved its energy sovereignty and energy cost problem fundamentally.
Our next generation are preparing for jobs that do not yet exist. Using technology, our children have the ability to solve the world's big problems.
The Australian innovation environment has suffered from a progressive reduction in real terms of public finance, basically. Bitcoin white paper, Satoshi Nakamoto actually spoke explicitly about getting away from dependency on trusted third parties.
Chinese leader Xi Jinping has a vision for the world that's run by Beijing's rules. He's expected to showcase China as an alternative global leader.
The security of one can only come with the security of others and vice versa. So I think that's why we're seeing a radically different approach from China and how it thinks the world can be governed.
Hi everyone, thank you for being here. Today's guest is Professor Warwick Powell. He is an Australian academic and entrepreneur whose work spans the fields of global political economy, digital technologies, and supply chain governance. He's a professor at Queensland University of Technology. He's also a senior fellow at Taihe Institute in Beijing. His book, China, Trust, Digital Supply Chains, Dynamics of a Zero Trust World, provides a critical reflection on blockchain technologies, data flows, and the changing nature of international economic relationships in and around China. He's also the founder of Smart Trade Networks, which is a blockchain technology development and commercialization company. So welcome, Professor Warwick. Great to talk to you. How are you?
I'm very well. Good to be with you.
So how's your day been? Just started?
Well, it's my day starts pretty early, so I've been going for probably about 4 or 5 hours already.
Okay, that's all right. I know you're short on time, so I'll get straight to the points. But again, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me. I really appreciate it. So Trump is going to talk to Xi today. Do you think anything will come out of it? I'm only asking is because Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said that China's economy is weak and that China is trying to harm global economy by controlling the export of critical minerals and rare earth material. I think a couple of weeks ago, he also said that IMF and World Bank should probably police China's economic policies. So it seems like he was lashing out on China because no deal has yet been made. But do you think anything's going to come out of this Trump and Xi meeting?
Well, if 5% growth or 5.2% growth is weak, then I'd hate to think how Scott Bessent would describe the American economy at 2%. Scott Bessent has a demonstrated track record over the last 6 months of overreach and hyperbole. I wouldn't take anything he says particularly seriously, either in terms of his prognostications about the Chinese economic situation, which he fundamentally doesn't understand, or his prognostications about the Russian economy, which they consistently get wrong, and of course the bloviating about the state of the American economy, which is largely spin. The situation at the moment in relation to the meeting between Presidents Trump and Xi would suggest that some progress has been made towards a framework which will enable the parties to exploit some transactional opportunities to stabilize what has been something of a roller coaster over the last 6 months in the most recent spate of incidents, but arguably really for the past 8 to 9 years. The fact is that the Americans have a tendency to overtalk the nature of discussions coming up, in part because I think that there is a negotiating tactic that Americans tend to do, which is to try to verbal others to shape upcoming meetings and apply pressure. I'm surprised that they continue to do this when they're dealing with the Chinese, because clearly the Chinese don't react. There has also been some recent comments made by Foreign Minister Wang Yi as a result of his conversations with the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, which also indicates that we should have tempered expectations about whether or not the meeting between the national leaders will result in some grand bargain. I would suggest that that's highly unlikely. So what are we likely to get? Well, I think we're likely, in a glass half full kind of way, we're likely to get some agreements around some frameworks that will be premised on the fact that both parties will modify some of their positions on some relatively peripheral issues, frankly, in the scheme of things. But the core structural issues that underpin the dynamics between the United States and China will largely remain unchanged. I mean by that the fact that President Trump came into the election in November 2024 with a very clear and concise economic program. It was premised on a diagnostics which said that America's economic woes is caused by the fact that it is exploited by others, taken advantage of by others, and this is evidenced by the trade deficits that America has. The biggest culprit of all of that, as far as Trump economics is concerned, is China. In response, Trump favoured tariffs. They are, according to him, his favourite word. Without tariffs, there is nothing to Trump economics. And yet the tariffs that he flagged in his 2nd of April announcements, the Liberation Day announcements, that then escalated for about 10 days, were quickly walked back. And the most recent threats of 100% tariffs coming into place on the 1st of November looks like are going to get walked back as well. Now, if you take seriously Trump's diagnostics of the American economic situation, and if you take seriously the centrality of tariffs in Trump economics, any walking back of tariffs in relation to China really is a concession that the United States doesn't have the leverage to stick to its guns on what it believes, apparently, is the most important policy initiative and the most significant policy gun or bullet that it has to fire within its arsenal. So that's where I think things are at. Pretty modest expectations, but with a little bit of luck, there'll be a little bit of stability for a while anyway.
Sure. That was going to be my next question. Who has the leverage in these negotiations? The way I see things, nobody wins in a trade war, but I don't think America holds any cards over here. I think China is in a much stronger position. What's your take on that?
Look, there are a couple of ways that we need to look at this. One is, of course, in a very transactional sense, and the United States really doesn't have a great deal of immediate leverage. I think that's become very clear. And whilst there are some observers, particularly in the United States, who want to continue talking about the threat of the US dollar and all these sorts of things, the reality is that economic systems are material systems. They fundamentally depend upon being able to access and mobilize the resources of the world, which are real resources, whether they are the resources of the energy that is available to us or the other materials that exist in the world. And without those, you can have as many IOUs as you want, but it's really not going to make much difference. So what we've really learned, I think, in the last 6 months, or what people really should take away from the last 6 months, is why, at the end of the day, it's the real economy that matters, not the dollars and cents economy. That's the first point. But there is another dimension to all of this, and that is that this is not just a bilateral question. From China's point of view in particular, though arguably to some extent from the United States perspective too, what's going on is really of fundamental significance to the future shape of global governance and the balance of power internationally. China's attitude has been articulated very, very clearly for a number of years, most recently crystallized by way of 4 core documents that have been released over the course of the last 4 years. Global Development Initiative, Global Security Initiative, Global Governance Initiative was the latest one, and the Global Civilization Initiative. All of those try to paint a picture of China's attitude towards what an unfolding multipolarity should look like. And it suggests that China's approach to these kinds of bilateral negotiations is going to be, in part, conditioned by its sense of being a great nation, again, and a key driver of multipolarization. And as a result of that, I think China, drawing on its wellsprings of historical experience, understands that exploiting leverage excessively in a bilateral transactional environment without a sensibility to the long-lasting legacies that could have is unwise. And the wise approach is to actually look at the bigger picture. And the bigger picture means that the United States needs to have a reason to have a stake in the global game. It needs to have room to participate in the global economy, amongst other parts of international affairs, but no longer as a primacy-enabled hegemon, but as a normal country. It's not a small country, it's an important country, it's a big economy. But the aim, I think, is ultimately to enable the demise of Pax Americana to have a soft landing. Because without a soft landing, we're going to have a period of incredible turbulence and chaos that is avoidable, that could potentially erupt into far more significant rounds of kinetic violence. And China wants to avoid that. So I think China's approach to these negotiations has always been framed by these dual concerns. One is its bilateral relationships, which is driven by China's own belief that it should be treated as an equal and be treated with respect, that it shouldn't be walked over, that it shouldn't be treated in a way that sustains or perpetuates the humiliation that China experienced in the past, number one. But at the same time, China has no interest on essentially flipping the tables and imposing that same kind of national experience on others. It's seeking to shape a multipolar world that actually transcends these sorts of issues. And I think we're likely to see those attitudes continue to play a big part in China's general approach to these kinds of discussions.
I think you sort of mentioned that in one of your recent articles, probably you wrote it a couple of days ago. I forgot the title of that article. I think you mentioned 2 very interesting points in that article. One of that was China's approach to global leadership will be very different to Western colonialism. It will have its own distinct characteristics. The other thing was, and the question that I had for you after reading that article was, is America or are American politicians and leaders wise enough to understand their future position in the global economy and global political stage?
Look, I think that reality bats last, which means that at some point in time, reality will assert itself. And it will reassert itself as different actors in the world come to understand the nature of reality and what's going on, and in due course reflect upon how that's affecting them and where they sit within that. The American body politic has for a couple of centuries now, and certainly in the last 30 years, experienced a pretty singular trend. And that is towards one where the United States has emerged, particularly in the post-Soviet era, the post-1991 world, as the unquestioned primate. That has shaped attitudes, no doubt. The long history of the United States, the exceptional country, the light on the hill, the God-given mandate to pursue human perfection on earth and all those sorts of things, has long shaped the ways in which the American political elite have understood themselves and therefore their relationships with the rest of the world. Now, that has taken on a couple of different forms predominantly. over the course of American history. For a long time in the earlier days, the response to that was to actually focus internally, which was to attempt to create, a nirvana on earth, if you will, and protect that from the forces external to it that would seek to undermine it. But as time went on, pressures emerged that saw America turn outwards as it projected not only its sense of what the good life was, but also this belief that it had not only the capability, but also the right and obligation to use force if necessary to impose that across the globe. So it's very difficult when you've got that weight of history to just change your view, particularly if that involves a repudiation of all of that. So there's some generational problems. My sense, though, is that there is a new generation of Americans, people who will be, today in their 20s and younger, of course, whose understandings of the world and attitudes towards the world are quite different from prior generations. Whether that sustains going forward, time will tell, of course, but if these different attitudes persist, it does suggest that sometime in the future, as generational change takes place, that there will be a generation of Americans who will have a more grounded sense of the nature of the world, the fact that it is no longer a unipolar world, but that America can play a constructive, a contributing role in that new context. That's, again, a hopeful view as to what might happen. I think it will be difficult in the short term for that to take place, but we're starting to see debates emerge in America. And if you follow things like Foreign Policy magazine and other publications, which is really where the American foreign policy elite share ideas and debate amongst themselves, we are starting to see some questioning of the very foundations of American primacy, a recognition that China cannot be treated as a subordinate, and that in fact a new calibration is going to be required if America is going to be part of a world that doesn't collapse in kinetic warfare.
Thanks for that. But so you mentioned that China's approach to global leadership will be very different to Western colonialism. Are you basing it on the fact that China is, in the past, has tried to grow via trade and building infrastructure? I mean,
Two things, really.
Sure.
China has a long history of international interactions dating back thousands of years. That history has largely been underpinned by commercial exchange and the exchange of ideas, diplomacy, culture. That's not to say that there haven't been from time to time periodic bouts of conflict, but in the macro sense of things, China's own history and experience has been really premised on commercial interactions with other civilizations and cultures. So that's part one. Part two, though, is also a very particular sense of understanding that exists within the Chinese body politic about the nature of the world as it is today, and the changes that have been taking place and which continue to unfold before our very eyes. And what China, in effect, is seeing, so this is its frame, this is how it understands what's happening in the world, and therefore where it needs to fit into that, is that there are powerful forces at work that are undermining the short period of American unilateral hegemony, but also undermining and transforming 500 years of European-driven colonialism, where the economic structures of the world have largely been dominated by major single centres with a bunch of subordinate peripheries, to an economic structure globally that is far more distributed and in which there are no single powers that can dominate the world. And these things are happening anyway. That's the sort of Chinese view, the sort of long history view. These are forces that are working their way through the global economic order, and we are now reaching a period where the center periphery model of global economic structuring is beginning to fall away. The dominant modes of governance and regimes of accumulation, the political architecture that surrounded colonial expropriation, they're giving way, they're falling apart. And so, in that context, what does an emerging great power do? Well, it's likely to seek to, in a sense, ride that wave of change. It's not going to be pushing against it. It's not going to be pushing against multipolarity. It's going to seek to shape multipolarity. It's going to try to take advantage of these trends, whilst at the same time minimizing the downside risks associated with these forces. And so, in many respects, it's not necessarily about having to even say that China's nicer than others, to actually appreciate why there is a very different strategic disposition towards how China itself views itself and how it views the state of the world, and therefore how it shapes its own strategic conduct in relation to the world itself. And if I may make one last point, and that is that China also has a very distinct ontology or a cosmology about how the world is, which is fundamental to the way that it understands the nature of things. Rather than viewing the world as a discrete set or an atomized set of individual nations that kind of interact with each other in chaotic ways, bumping into each other when they must, China views the world as fundamentally, in its very nature, an interconnected organism. It's connected to the ecology of the planet as well. And this holistic sense of interconnectedness actually means that the conduct of one is shaped by the environment around it, just as it shapes the environment around it. So there is a dialectical relationship between how the elements within this integrated system interact with each other and create these dynamics. In Western academic terms, you'd probably call that a system dynamics view of the world, that there are feedback loops and that the system dynamics is a consequence of the interactions of the component parts. But instead of viewing the world as a discrete series of agents that then interact with each other, it actually sees them as fundamentally intertwined as part of their very nature. And because of that, its approach to questions of peace and development sees it frame those questions through a lens which is far more grounded in the idea of indivisibility, that development of one must take place in relation to the development of others. The security of one can only come with the security of others and vice versa. So I think that's why we're seeing a radically different approach from China towards not only the nature of the world itself, but its general attitude towards how it fits into the world and how it thinks the world can be governed.
I think that's probably why China hasn't invaded any other country like America has for the past, ever since World War II, I guess, because of that philosophy. So where do you see BRICS in the midst of all of this? How does BRICS organization fit in all of this?
Look, a part of multipolarity is actually a multi-layered mesh or a fabric of institutions that create a whole range of buffers, I guess, to absorb shocks, but to also create ways in which connectivity can take place and be enhanced and amplified. So BRICS is part and parcel of that. It's not the only institution that is integral to the unfolding multipolarization of the world. Others include things like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, regional trade agreements, etc., etc. So BRICS emerged 20 odd years ago to bring some voice for a small group of developing countries in a world that was at the time still dominated by the nations of the transatlantic West, the G7 and their immediate allies. And at that time, the developing world really believed that its issues and its interests had been marginalized and did not have voice. For the period since the end of the Second World War, for example, where we witnessed the liberation of many previously colonized peoples and saw the formal emergence of a whole raft of new independent nations. That did not necessarily lead to economic independence or economic development for many. And I think that BRICS emerged in that context first and foremost. As time went by, BRICS found cohesion through the ways in which the member states could address issues that were common to them and overcome barriers that inhibited their ability, first and foremost, to interact more effectively with each other. So that's really the nature of BRICS. And if you extend that ethos now out to a growing BRICS network, it is seeking to enable the emergence of forms of networked organizations that don't necessarily have strong central impositions on participants, but which sees governance emerge from the bottom up. That, of course, creates its own dilemmas because, the more people you have sitting around the table, the slower decisions take, the more difficult it is to achieve consensus, etc. And I think they're going to be some of the issues that BRICS as a growing network are going to be contemplating over the next few years. But BRICS is one of the many layers in a multi-layered fabric that we are now calling multipolarity, or perhaps a better way to describe this, and this is borrowing on a term from former American Ambassador Chas Freeman, that the world's really becoming multi-nodal. And the reason I think Ambassador Freeman distinguishes multipolar from multi-nodal is that poles seem to be very self-contained, whereas the idea of nodes implies a greater sense of interconnectivity and dynamic interplay. So perhaps we would be better off describing the emerging landscape as multinodal, but I think we're all very familiar with the term multipolar.
No, thanks for that. So do you think BRICS will lead to de-dollarization at some point in future? Or will it have its own currency? Or is an alternative currency really necessary for a multinodal or multipolar world?
Probably no, and no. We've got to understand that this question of de-dollarization is probably better understood through the lens of currency multipolarity. That what we are likely to see is the emergence of global interactions that take place much more on a peer-to-peer basis between nations and the entities of different nations, and that those transactions will be settled in units of account that those two independent nations control separately. So that's the first point. The second point goes to the question of a new currency, I think, right? And again, I don't think that that's necessary to enable the settlement of international cross-border exchanges in national currencies. It's actually a relatively recent phenomenon, this idea that there is a national currency that functions as a global reserve. And I don't think that that's necessary at all for the world to be able to work smoothly. It's increasingly less necessary also in an environment where there is actually a common language, and the common language is mathematics and zeros and ones. So as information becomes increasingly digitalized and the settlement of accounts can be accounted for and kept track of in digital formats, then it is actually much easier to be able to handle these issues on a peer-to-peer basis anyway. So my own sense is that we're seeing an unfolding currency multipolarization, number one, and that will not lead to, in any near future context or even medium term, some idea of a new currency generally. I don't believe that BRICS has any intentions on going down the path of creating a BRICS currency. I think that there are very serious lessons that are being taken out of the experiences of the European Union and the creation of the euro as a single currency for that group of countries, which has frankly been a disaster for many of those countries. So, look, I don't think that we should have any expectations that that this process of currency multipolarization will lead to some new currency that replaces the United States but fulfills the same function.
Thanks for that. Just before I move on, just on that, why euro was a disaster for some of the countries? Can you give one or two examples? Or
well,
one
they don't
example?
control their own currency, right? So, particularly countries that become indebted. So, if you're indebted to others in a currency that you don't issue, you've got to go and figure out how you can get that currency to settle your debts, or at least to service your debts. And if the authority to issue that particular unit of currency sits in a place that you have no capacity to influence, and in fact you're subordinated to the rules that enable you to even access and utilize this currency that others control, then you're always going to be exposed to the whims and fancies of those institutions. And that's precisely what's happened. Just take a look at Greece, for example. I mean, that's a classic case in point where the loss of currency sovereignty undermined the ability of the Greek financial and economic authorities to actually drive the adjustments in ways that did not expose the Greek social settlement to the imperatives of Brussels. I mean, that's just one example.
Right, thanks for that. I want to go back to Scott Bessent's statement that IMF and World Bank should police China's economic policies. What does he want these two institutions to do? I mean, I don't think those two institutions wield any power over China anyway. I mean, what was he trying to achieve? Do you have any idea?
When the IMF held its recent meetings, Bessent gave a speech where he argued that the IMF and the World Bank as well should, from his point of view, go back to TORS. He argued that these institutions had become distracted in their core mission by taking an interest in things like climate change, green financing, etc., etc. So he wanted these organisations to go back to their core business model, which revolved around a very particular view of these institutions as bankers of last resort, which enabled them to ultimately impose certain kinds of policy conditions on countries that borrowed money from them. That's what he wants. The political architecture of these two institutions sees the United States in a position to exercise veto rights. So the United States ultimately, push comes to shove, is able to dictate the terms of the IMF and the World Bank today. It's actually one of the areas of emerging contention, I think, between the global South and the global North, the legacy institutional setup of these Bretton Woods and post-Bretton Woods arrangements. And so Bessent, in a sense, is trying to reclaim American authority over other economies through institutions that the United States politically can control. I don't think it's going to go anywhere. But, this is, in some respects, a symptom of an American political elite that has yet to come to terms with the changing world. In some ways, Bessent can see that the ability of the West to control countries like China and to dictate policy terms to places like China has diminished substantially, indeed all but fallen away. And he is trying to reclaim their ability to do so. What do we say? The horse has already bolted.
Yeah, that's true. But China hasn't taken any developmental loan, none from IMF, none from World Bank. So I was also wondering, what does Bessent want World Bank and IMF to do about China? They don't really hold any power. Do you think just China has had a very meteoric economic and technological rise after 1980s? Other countries can emulate China's model as well to progress if they want to. Do you think, is that model replicable in other countries?
Well, I'll say two things. Firstly, the Chinese themselves say that their model can't be replicated. in large part because they say that they're a country of 1.4 billion, and there's only one other country in the world with that same number of people, but it's nonetheless fundamentally different. So that question of scale, I think, in some ways affects the way the Chinese have thought about the challenges that they've had. They also came from a very distinct historical experience, which was 100 years of collapse, what the Chinese view as 100 years of humiliation, where centuries of dynastic rule came to an end, and Western forces, with very, very few men holding guns, was literally able to take charge of a whole bunch of critical points across China. So in that sense, it was a very unique set of experiences. The issue about whether or not there are lessons to be learned, however, I think is an interesting one. And we need to look beyond 1980, and we need to go back to, say, 1949, 1950. And you have to remember that after the end of the Civil War and the declaration of the People's Republic of China in 1949, that at that point in time, China was literally a decimated country. Infrastructure was non-existent. Cities had been destroyed through war. There'd been significant losses of life during the course of 10 years of conflict with the Japanese, and then ultimately in the Civil War itself. Literacy levels were at about 20%, and life expectancy had barely reached 40 years of age. So you could see that as a society, in very fundamental material terms, it really didn't have much to start with. And over the course of the next 40 years, so 1950 to say 1990, the transformations that were undertaken really were in very systematic ways, with some episodes of exuberance and success and failure and learning and recalibrating and all those sorts of things. But the foundation for all of this has been addressing the quality of the people. That's actually the fundamental foundation. And it did it in two critical ways. One was through education. Literacy today is over 95%, 97% or thereabouts. So we've gone from 20% to basically everybody can read and write. If you can't read and write, you're never going to be able to do all those other things that are necessary if an economy and a society are going to become more modern. So literacy was foundational. China also tackled the root causes of life expectancy, and today life expectancy is well into the 70s now. More so, in fact, life expectancy in China is higher than the United States today. And China announced recently that it is seeking to pursue life expectancy on average of about 80 years of age for most people during the course of this next 5-year plan. So foundationally to China's economic development was actually educating people and ensuring that people could live longer. And that required tackling questions around food security and improving health. Okay, so foundations were laid. The second thing that we learned in the Chinese experience is that public control over the instruments of finance is actually vital. So very, very few people talk about the nature of China's finance system, but China's finance system as a publicly owned set of institutions is actually fundamental to China's success in prosecuting its economic development model. It has been able to channel credit into the economic system to drive certain kinds of activities over the course of the last 70 odd years. And it's done that in stages. So it started off with stabilizing the agricultural situation. It then went into addressing small scale manufacturing. It had problems when the China or the Sino-Soviet split took place because it lost a lot of expertise, but it nonetheless persevered and continued. China then understood the criticality of rolling out and progressively expanding a network of what I call the infrastructure of flow. And by that I mean the infrastructure that enables people to move, that enables goods to move, and ultimately also enables information to move. So roads, railroads, ports, airports. Then we have to enable things like water to flow. Then we have to enable energy to flow, electricity systems. We then have to enable information to flow, right? Data networks, telecommunications. So that was the next layer. And again, without that, you're never going to get economic development. But all of that was made possible by government-funded and government-financed investment in critical infrastructure as the main autonomous driver of Chinese capital accumulation. So are there lessons in that? I think there are. There is currently an ongoing debate amongst China watchers about whether or not there's an imbalance between investment and consumption in China. It's a nonsense debate because it assumes that proportions actually make the difference when, in fact, if you go back to the early 1960s, consumption as a percentage of GDP in China was well into the 60% range, and China was a damn sight lot poorer then than it is today. So a higher proportion of GDP underpinned by domestic consumption versus investment doesn't necessarily equal improved living standards, right? So that's the first canard that I think we need to get rid of. The second thing to understand is that, in fact, consumption and investment are intimately interrelated. You can't consume what you don't create, right? What are you going to consume? Thin air? Right? So consumption actually presupposes production, and production presupposes investment. You can't spend on consumption what you don't earn. Where do you get your earnings from? From the wages that you earn by doing the things that make the things that were funded by investment. So logically, investment always comes first in these systems anyway. So this idea that somehow, we've got this sort of horrible imbalance between consumption and investment misunderstands the dynamic interplay between all of this. The last point to say about this particular debate and the lessons to be learned by others is that there's this moralizing that you get mainly from Western commentators about how China saves too much. And they say China saves too much for all these reasons, they don't have social security, et cetera, whatever it is. So there's this moralizing about this savings rate. And then they say, and that therefore leads to this excess of investment. It gets the causality all wrong. The causality runs the other way. Savings is not a constraint. Savings is actually a consequence. Right? Savings is an artifact of everything else. You can't save what you don't earn. You only save what you don't spend. If you're satisfied, or if your material objectives and needs are actually satisfied with whatever spending you take, what you've got left is just what you've got left. And because investment is actually financed through publicly owned financial institutions that can issue its own currency, the fact that credit can be created ex nihilo, right, out of the blue, out of thin air. They are IOUs after all. Credit is not constrained at all by savings. That's another nonsense, right? So there's this sort of important lessons to learn. Firstly, publicly owned finance, foundational. Secondly, invest in people. Make sure people are healthy. Make sure they're more fit as time goes by. If you're not fit, you're not going to be able to work. Right? Foundational stuff. Recognize that investment drives consumption and focus on that. Put aside all of these sort of Western moralizations about the need for more consumption. That will come anyway. As new things get created and produced, lo and behold, people consume more. But you can't consume what you don't make. So what people take from that in terms of institutional design and policy design will ultimately be a matter for them. Look, one other thing I should probably mention is that a key focus in the last 12 months or 12 years or so has been a radical transformation of the fundamental systems of energy creation and distribution. Okay, so all economic systems are fundamentally thermodynamic systems, and being able to drive your system towards higher levels of energy return on energy invested enables your system, your society and economy to have more energetic surpluses for other things. Now, China's been doing that through significant investments in renewable energies, clean energies, amongst other things. The other benefit, other than enabling the system to transition to a higher energy return on energy invested setup, is that it expands your energy sovereignty footprint, which means, again, you are more in control of the resources you've got available for your own economic and social development. If your economic and social development is fundamentally constrained by the fact that your energy sources come from somewhere else and that you need to finance the purchase of that energy from somewhere else by securing that foreign currency, then you've immediately circumscribed your own ability to pursue an autonomous and sovereign economic development. So China's experience in that, I think, is fundamental. And the fact that it is exporting incredibly low-cost renewable energy capabilities around the world is actually going to leave a lasting legacy on the capacity of developing nations to pursue their own autonomous sovereign development paths.
No, that's true. But China is producing so much when it comes to EVs, renewable energy products. You sort of wonder, does Europe need to produce anything at all now? Should they just pack up and go home? Because everything can be manufactured and
Europe's
produced
not a
by
single
China.
thing. And I know we often sort of talk about places as if they're singular, Europe and United States and China and things. But it's actually enterprises that ultimately, make decisions inside systems. So nation states can design systems, but enterprises need to, do their thing, if you will. And that's the interplay, I guess, between what happens on the ground and how you design a set of institutions that make things possible. Look, Europe's problem, if you will, is that it has not solved its energy sovereignty and energy cost problem fundamentally. That's its first problem. Its second problem is that instead of resolving its own security questions, the Russia question, which, by the way, is a 300-year plus question, instead of actually resolving that constructively, particularly in the post-Soviet era, it lent on legacy institutions and legacy mindsets such as NATO as a way of keeping that under control. Right? Now, that would have all been fine had Russia not re-emerged as a great power. If Russia got pulled apart in the 1990s, got balkanized, had its assets stripped and privatized, which was happening, then you'd probably get away with it. But that's not what ended up happening. So as Russia, particularly over the last 20 years, changed its direction and consolidated, again, this sense of being a singular nation or a singular civilization state, albeit federated, the legacy instruments and mechanisms that those in Western Europe sought to manage a relationship with Russia became less meaningful. So no energy, no answers on energy, no answers on security architecture. You put those two things together and you've got a political elite that's distracted from the things that actually matter. It's incapable of reaching constructive security arrangements with its near neighbour, and consequently now is committing more and more European resources to addressing a problem that they should have solved 35 years ago. And that's going to draw away from the ability of European nations to address the needs of today and to also take advantage of the opportunities that are available to Europe. So, that's Europe. Chinese production continues to grow. And again, there's a Western trope from certain quarters which talks about overcapacity. Needless to say, we never heard anything about overcapacity when the Germans and the Japanese and the Koreans were exporting. But nonetheless, we hear a lot of it now. And it's a nonsense, right? And it's a nonsense in large part because a whole bunch of this capacity couldn't actually be replicated elsewhere anyway, certainly not in the near term. So in many regards, this is global capacity. The gripe really is that it's not Western capacity. That's really the gripe. The second thing about this is that it tries to paint a picture that Chinese consumption demand is insufficient to absorb what China produces. And then words like weak demand and suppressed consumers come into the picture. The reality is that Chinese manufactured outputs continue to grow, and the substantial majority, I'm talking 80% or thereabouts of all outputs, are absorbed in the domestic market. In fact, in the last 9 months, in the EV sector alone, about 90% of EVs, which are growing in number, are actually sold in the Chinese market. Only 10% of the output is exported. The other thing that's happening, of course, is that these sorts of companies, particularly EV companies, are investing all around the world to create assembly facilities and also manufacturing facilities. So over time, we're going to see actually increased capacity, greater output in EVs, not less, but that a large chunk of this output in the future will be found dotted around the world. It won't all come from China. There will be factories in Brazil pumping out cars. There'll be factories in Thailand pumping out EVs. There'll actually be factories in Europe pumping out EVs as well. And of course in North Africa, and in due course, I think we'll start to see EV factories emerge at the southern end of the African continent too. And so, if we don't actually produce more EVs or have the capacity to produce more EVs, we're going to actually have a shortage of capacity. So far from the world experiencing an overcapacity in EVs, we've actually got a shortage of capacity. Same for solar and wind power. If you go across the African continent and large parts of South America, as well as parts of Southeast Asia, there is still a dramatic need for energy systems to be deployed, enabling places to ultimately not only industrialize, no energy, no industrialization, but actually much more foundationally deliver core services to households such as lighting, potable water, and wastewater treatment. Now, you think about what those three things do. With lighting, and also access to things like computers and stuff, we're able to enhance educational outcomes. Kids can't read in the evening and do homework in the evening if there's no electricity. Okay. So think back to the Chinese economic development experience. Educate the people. We also want potable water and the delivery of wastewater treatment systems across urban environments. Why do we need those? Well, because they fundamentally improve the health of the urban environment and the urban population. Again, go back to the Chinese development experience, which was around the question of life expectancy. Right? Clean water, treated water, lighting, fundamental, all of which depend upon having low-cost electricity. So Chinese capacity is actually enabling all these things to happen around the world. The gripe is that it's Chinese capacity and not Western capacity.
No, I sort of agree with you over here. It's just because they're buying Chinese products, they're not buying Western products. That's where the complaint comes from when you hear European or American leaders talk about it. I know we are short on time. I just want to, I've got one question on American economy. I'll share my screen with you, and then I'll ask window, my screen. Let me know when you see the screen share.
Something's coming. Here we go.
Okay, so here. So
yep.
I've got top 5 economies of the world, plus I've got Australia over here.
Yep.
On the right-hand side, 1.75 trillion US dollars. So that's the GDP. That's GDP per capita. So Australia is doing really well, 64,000 per capita. But when we go to R&D as a percentage of GDP, it's 1.7%. So India is low, 0.7%. Australia is 1.7%. America 3.6%. China 2.6, which to me seems low. But then the OECD average is 2.7%. So Australia is below that average. Do you have any thoughts why that is the case? Why Australia? I mean, the reason I'm asking is because I'm sort of correlating R&D to innovation. And why Australia is probably slow in innovation or lags behind America or China when it comes to innovation or innovating products?
Well, each political economy has its own sort of setups for resourcing innovation, but I think the Australian innovation environment has suffered from a progressive reduction in real terms of public finance, basically. And we see that in the budget cuts to leading institutions such as the CSIRO. Australian governments have, for a long time, talked a lot about commitments to research and development, but in fundamental terms, I think there has been a lot of pressure on research and development budgets. Clearly, as you can see, the Australian situation comparatively is lower than those of other places. You could run the argument that Australia spends its dollars more efficiently, and maybe there's some truth in that, maybe not. But unless there is serious commitment to research and development, nations are ultimately going to struggle with being able to continually innovate and respond to emergent problems. Let's not forget that every time human beings create something to solve a problem, we tend to create 2 new problems that we know of and maybe 10 new problems that we don't know of. And that seems to be a fundamental driver of how these systems work. And innovation is not only about creating the solution to yesterday's problem, but serious innovation is about anticipating what the problems are to the solutions that you've created. And that requires R&D. So getting ahead of the curve is dependent upon a commitment to resourcing people who are working at those leading edges of things that we might not expect to be there, but in fact are possible challenges coming forward as a result of the things that we did. We solve problems and create new ones.
No, that's true. That's true. I've got one last question, and that's from your book. So in your book, you discuss the concept of a zero trust world. I mean, could you explain what you mean by that briefly, and how these systems can enforce rules without relying on trust?
Yeah, trust is a very interesting word, isn't it, in the English language, and it's often used and abused in different contexts and actually has different meanings. What I try to do in the book is tease out particular views about trust and approaches to questions of trust, and why, in fact, in a lot of cross-border transactional environments, trust is probably not a good way of thinking about the problem, and we would probably be better thinking about the challenges in cross-border trade and settlements through a lens which talks a lot more about informational dependability. So I asked the question, what makes trust and not something else, right? And the literature is actually pretty, it's actually not well developed. For a long time, there was not much philosophical work done on the question of trust. It was just used as a concept without, thoroughly interrogating what it might mean and whether it had any distinctive properties. So in the information world, trust is actually at best a 5-letter word, but at worst it actually denotes something that is undesirable, actually. So in an information systems context, if the integrity of that system is dependent upon the actions of single actors, that makes the system highly vulnerable and high risk, right? But that's also a system characterized as a high trust system. The system works if you trust the integrity of a single actor. So in the blockchain space, if we go back to the 2008-2009 Bitcoin white paper, Satoshi Nakamoto actually spoke explicitly about getting away from dependency on trusted third parties. And most people in many regards have misunderstood that, and they tried to re-articulate this as a question of reinserting trust. That's not what this was about. This was actually about creating institutions where informational integrity was not dependent upon the integrity of single actors. So that's one way that trust really is something to be avoided, ironically. The other thing about trust, and this comes from a particular thread in the philosophical literature, and it's what's known as phenomenology, which is the ways in which humans experience relationships. It basically says something like, trust is an interpersonal relationship. It describes a relationship as opposed to describing something as a property of something, right? So often trust in lay terms is described as something that somebody has, or something, an institution has, right? That it's a property. Whereas in the phenomenological literature, it talks about trust as a way of describing the nature of a certain kind of relationship. And it's a very distinctive kind of relationship between people, where in fact it involves exposing oneself to vulnerabilities, right? Far more so than in other contexts. So if there is a relationship of trust between two people, it actually means that the two people are exposing themselves to the possibilities that they'll be let down. But in doing so, they're also open to the possibilities of the vulnerability that comes with that. And you'll find that in relationships where people trust each other, they actually don't interrogate each other very much. They accept things that others say and do without questioning. Right? So, this idea of transparency that's often used, as a proxy for trust. We need more transparency to have more trust. Well, in fact, transparency happens and is insisted upon when there's no trust. But if there is trust between parties, you actually don't need transparency at all. You just take as credible what someone else says. So I looked into all of this and came to a view that most transactions, so we're dealing really with cross-border transactions, are transactions that involve organizations where there are no genuine interpersonal relationships. They are literally relationships between strangers, or in fact relationships between processes. The people who run the payments office in a large organization actually have no relationship with the supplier at all. They make decisions about settling accounts based on pieces of paper. Right? And what they're interested in is whether or not the pieces of paper satisfy the rules. So I distinguish then this relationship that people have between people, and the relationship that people have with information, and the relationship that people have with things like machines. So when I use a machine, I have an expectation that the machine will behave in repeatable and reliable ways. Right? I turn the car key, the car starts. I use a vending machine. I put money in it, I push some buttons and something pops out. That does not rely on trust. I don't trust my car, right? But I do depend upon it. And I depend upon it because I have a relationship that's grounded in this sense of reliability. Right? So we distinguish between reliability, dependability, and those sorts of things, and trust. So a lot more transactions can be undertaken if we focused a lot more on sorting out the conditions necessary to achieve dependability and reliability, as opposed to worrying about trust and stuff. So that's the long story, I think, to trying to answer your question. Well, perhaps it's the short story, because I think that there is a much longer story.
Yeah, it's a short story, but it's a pretty comprehensive one. Again, no, thanks for that. I really appreciate you taking the time. I know you're a busy person, but hopefully we can continue this at some other time in future. It's been very informative talking to you, especially about China and the Chinese economy. I do have follow-up questions, but maybe next time. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, definitely. Thank you very much, Professor Warwick. I'll stop recording now.